Hi, everyone. I'm so excited. I'm so excited to be here. Right, let's see if technology lets me down. So do bear with me whilst I'm trying to share my screen. We've tested it and it will hopefully works. And whilst I'm trying to share my screen, right, yeah, you should all see it now. So a few things before we start the session. I want this to be kind of playful. It's a serious topic, disasters, but let's try to make it less serious. So hopefully in your chat, as if by magic, you will see a link appearing to a bingo sheet. That Cassie has kindly agreed to put it for us there. And it is your normal bingo. I'm sure you know how to play the game. So when you hear a word, please cross it out. I do know which word comes last, so there is no cheating. But the first person to fill in the bingo would have to shout, i.e. type in the chat using capital letters, the word bingo. And then we will look after this talk who was the first, and that person will get a prize, and I will show you the prize after the talk. So fun and games, and let's try the talk. So we talk about disasters so much. We hear about disasters all the time. But I don't want to go straight into disasters. I want to tell you a little story about three little pigs. I'm sure you're all familiar with the story, right? And to me, this story isn't about pigs at all. To me, this story is about a disaster. So what I'm trying to do now is I will tell you the story, but in a slightly different way, because I've actually went and spoken to pigs and people who know them, or pigs who know them, because I want to learn a little bit about them, right? And so as I tell you the story, the probably revised version of Three Little Pigs, hopefully let's see whether the understanding of a disaster that the story is may change. So let's go. So once upon a time, there are three little pigs who had been neighbors all their life. One day, when these three little pigs had grown up into bigger pigs, it was time for them to go and explore the world and to live on their own. But all along, since they were kids, they were always told that there is a big, bad wolf out there. So the first little pig had been raised by his grandmother, who gave him all the love and care in the world. But they were very, very poor, and the grandma was actually really ill. And so the first little pig couldn't go to school, and instead he had to fetch water, look after the house, and eat whatever scraps they could find. Although grandma would always turn it into something really, really delicious. Many other pigs thought that he doesn't go to school because he's lazy and stupid, but they never asked. And so when it was time to go off on his own, grandma couldn't really give him anything but her love. So the second little pig had been raised by her mother, who gave her all the love and care in the world. She always encouraged her little pig to study hard and learn different skills. And she even saved up a little bit of money for when it was time for the little pig to go off and live on her own. The third little pig had been raised by his father, who also gave him all love and care in the world, along with a piece of gold to help his pig when it was time for him to go off to live on his own. And so the first little pig, not having any money, found some straw and built a pretty but very little house. And he was really, really proud of himself for having been able to build it on his own. The second little pig used all the coins her mother gave her to buy some branches, but still she didn't have enough money to buy all the branches she needed. So she kind of decided she will find a job and then continue building her house at some point in the future. And the third little pig used a portion of his piece of gold to buy all the bricks he needed. And so he was able to build a beautiful and solid house, and employed the second little pig to build a house for him, although he didn't pay her very much. He also figured that perhaps it's better not to keep the remaining gold in the house, especially when there are other builder pigs around. And so he sent his gold to the piggy bank. One day, a wolf came sniffing his way along, hungry as anything. He saw three little pigs and his stomach rumbled. Tonight, the wolf told himself, I'm going to eat those pigs for dinner. So the wolf knocked on the door of the first little pig in the house made of straw and said, little pig, let me in. But the first little pig didn't let him in, and so the wolf huffed and puffed and blew the house down. The first little pig ran as fast as his 4 legs would carry him to the home of the neighbor and friend, the second little pig, who lived in the house made of branches. The wolf ran after the first little pig, who slammed the door of the second pig's house into the wolf's face. The 2 little pigs trembled with fear when the wolf knocked on the second little pig's door and said, little pigs, let me in. But the pigs didn't. And the wolf huffed and puffed and blew the house down. The first and second little pigs ran as fast as they had ever run. But the first little pig couldn't run very fast. He was weak from not getting enough nutrition and all the hard work he had to do since when he was growing up. So the wolf caught him. The second little pig got to the brick house, but the neighbor, the third pig, wouldn't open the door. Instead, he watched the second pig also being eaten by the wolf. The wolf noticed the third little pig, once again knocked on the door and went to the pig's house, but the pig didn't open it. So the wolf began to huff and puff, but even the wolf couldn't blow down the third little pig's solid brick home. The wolf ran away crying, and the third little pig tweeted that, isn't it crazy that the wolves are completely out of control and they just keep coming back all the time, but thankfully I'm okay. So perhaps this is not quite the bad story you were told as a child, or maybe you wouldn't tell this particular story to your children, but the premise is the same, how each pig built a house in a different way. And of course, we kind of think that the lazy one built a house out of straw, not so lazy, used some skills and used branches, right? And the industrious one used the brick. But then along came this big bad wolf and kind of blew down the straw house and the wooden house and only left the brick structure standing. Implied in this nursery story, however, is another message that what is considered best practice when it comes to risk management and disaster preparedness. This emphasis is all about applying the appropriate technology, in our case, brick house, to withstand the perceived hazard, i.e. wolf and strong winds, that has come to constitute the dominant way in which disasters are conceived of and prepared for in Western imaginaries and policies. And so it is assumed that people are put at risk from hazard because they are in the wrong spot at the wrong time. The proper response is therefore to apply the necessary scientific experience and technological solution to predict or prevent the threat and so to reduce the risk. But what this story is really telling us, if we consider the context in which these pigs grew up, and if we look at the background in which all of this story unfolds, is that it is not the big bad wolf that creates a disaster. And moreover, we usually know about the big bad wolf, but often we don't have resources to protect ourselves or are indeed prevented from protecting ourselves. And this is what we're going to talk about today. So in the next half an hour or so, I will explore whether it is the wolf, i.e. the natural hazards, that we need to worry about, or should we instead be focusing on how we talk and think about disasters and their origins. So a little bit about disasters. Let's start with some numbers. We hear about disasters pretty much every day, and this is because they impact on our lives massively. Good news first, the number of people killed by disasters is actually decreasing, and that is great. However, the overall impact and particularly the losses from disasters are on the rise. You can see here that the economic losses are increasing and different countries are, of course, affected differently. There also remains a gap on economic losses from disasters worldwide. From 2000 to 2019, only 35% of all disasters reported any figures for economic losses. And records are particularly incomplete from Africa and South Asia. So we only have data for about 13% of disasters in Africa, that in terms of economic losses, and only for about 23% of all disaster events in South Asia. And so we also need to remember that much of these losses are not actually insured. As Regina already pointed out in her keynote earlier today, climate change also plays quite a significant role. And so climate-induced hazards and their frequency and intensity are on the increase. And the exact change varies regionally, as you can see again on the slide, so we can see how the numbers increase. What we also need to bear in mind is the places that disasters affect. So disasters largely affect urban areas because this is where kind of the infrastructure is, right? This is where the costs are and therefore economic losses are. And so as the world is getting more and more urbanized, it becomes critical that we take this into consideration. And I want to show you really quickly this pretty amazing map that the economists put together. So what you can see here is how over the past 80 years, the size and the number of cities around the world has increased. So if you look carefully and kind of notice the red and orange blurbs, you can see how they're rising, right? And how they're really now spread all around the world. And we know historically that cities have largely been located and founded in the coastal areas because of the trade, right? And it was easy to kind of to move around, and also near volcanoes where the soils are particularly good for agriculture. And we see this trend continuing. Of course, it's much easier to move now, but nevertheless, because the foundations of the city were on the coast, that's where the cities grow. What's interesting, however, and you can see this in this table on the slide now, is the pattern of growth. So the size of the city historically would reflect the economic development or the prominence of a city. And we can see that in the beginning of the 20th century, all the largest cities were located in the global north. And so London, was the largest city in the 1900s with a population of less than 7 million. So now we kind of don't even consider it to be a big of a city. But if you start moving through this table and if you start moving right, you will notice how the geographical location of the cities is changing. And so we are now predicting that by the end of the 21st century, by the beginning of the 22nd century, all of the largest cities will be located in the global south. And just imagine living in a city that has 88 million people in it. What it would be like, what kind of pressure would be put on infrastructure, and how would people actually live together and navigate the city. So these are the kind of things that we really need to consider when we talk about disasters, when we think about disasters, and if we are to have a future. Cities attract people because very often they concentrate much of the national economic activity, government, commerce, transportation, and also they provide critical links with rural areas, between cities, right, and also across international borders. We've seen now, I think, in the past year and a half, as the COVID started, how much these global links are important for us, right? They affect every single one of us in different ways. And so urban living is very often associated with high levels of literacy and education, improved health, greater access to social services, as well as enhanced opportunities for cultural and political participation. Nevertheless, rapid urban expansion puts cities' infrastructure, environment, and social aspects under pressure, with the challenges being intertwined and thus very, very hard to resolve. So when we talk about disasters, it is these challenges and the history of these challenges that many cities and people in the cities are facing now that we really need to bear in mind, because this is exactly what turns natural hazards into disasters. And this is best, of course, demonstrated by example. I guess many of you have heard about the Haiti earthquake in 2010. Even now, 11 years later, we see extensive damages caused to the built environment that largely were a result of a low quality building stock and lack of enforced building standards. So structures in Haiti were often informally constructed in a kind of ad hoc manner. And some buildings were built on slopes without sufficient foundation or steel support. But why was that? Why were the structures poorly constructed in the first place? And why the reconstruction hasn't really taken place in a way that it would have done, say, in New York or Tokyo? Largely because of the political powers that govern the country. Here, corruption and the lack of governmental leadership has been accompanied by a missing legal framework and weak law enforcement. The national government of Haiti does not meet the task of guaranteeing civil protection and considering the requirements of those people most in need. It does not take responsibility for securing food supply or improving the weak sanitation and health system. Missing leadership also became evident during the response and recovery after the 2010 earthquake, when the coordination mechanisms of humanitarian aid weren't really there. There was hardly kind of any sufficient leadership, which kind of led to chaos, and all the aid was very centralized, so people on the margins couldn't get access to it. And all of this is rooted in the heritage of a colonial system, slavery, and economic exploitation, as well as continuing influence of foreign powers in Haiti's domestic affairs, starting immediately after its independence. So this is the state that functions against the best interest of the public and is rather geared towards serving the political, social, and business elites. This vulnerability has been further exacerbated by reconstruction efforts. In October 2013, for example, Haitian government launched the country's first national housing policy because there was a shortage of 500,000 houses, and Haiti needed those houses by 2020. But the government-led new housing projects were affected by corruption and mismanagement, as well as by poor coordination and lack of funds. And so on top of this, all disputes over land ownerships have proved a major obstacle because the earthquake destroyed the majority of title deeds and land registry records. So we're kind of seeing how the situation that was in Haiti prior to earthquake is kind of continuing, right, as not being changed. In contrast, the earthquake that occurred in Chile 1 month later after the Haiti earthquake, and that earthquake was actually high in magnitude, killed far less people. Whilst 525 deaths is significant compared to approximately 200,000 deaths in Haiti, we can see that the number is very different. And so the significant difference is commonly attributed to more sophisticated building codes in Chile that incorporate seismic design and the historic enforcement of those codes. But it is also attributed to the overall higher levels of equality and education among the population, which is again very much due to the enforcement during the Allende regime, so socialist Allende regime, although this has, of course, since been very much challenged by various capitalist forces. But now, there might be a positive turn as Chile elected a new government yesterday. So we're all kind of hoping to see what that would lead to, hopefully some positive changes. Well, and hopefully these two examples show that there is a really big difference between a natural hazard, in our case, it was an earthquake, and a disaster. So everything that happened in Haiti and Chile as what we say kind of result of the earthquake. And so once this difference is established, it becomes clearer why so many of us argue that disasters are not natural. The idea that disaster is not natural is not new. In fact, Rousseau, in his letters to Voltaire in 1756, wrote about this. Rousseau was reflecting on the Lisbon earthquake that, of course, flattened the city, and that was kind of the start of disaster science and disaster studies, if you wish. Academically, the discussions about non-natural disasters have become really prominent in the 1970s. So there is a seminal paper published in the 1976 in Nature by Phil O'Keefe and colleagues, late Phil O'Keefe and colleagues, we lost him last year. And then in the 90s, Blakey, Wisner, Cannon, and many other colleagues who are kind of prominent in disaster scholarships continue this argument further. If you're interested, I would highly recommend the book called At Risk, which is edited by Wisner et al. But despite the definitions and 250 years of arguments, we are still blaming nature for disasters. This is because our approach to disasters is very hazard-centric. We see disaster as an event, but in reality, it is a process that has already started because the decisions taken today or even many decades ago will have consequences for the impact of a disaster in the future. But does it really matter when we say disasters instead of natural disasters? Well, it does, because disasters do not happen unless people and cities are vulnerable due to marginalization, discrimination, and inequitable access to resources, knowledge, and support. The last century has witnessed mass urbanization that has occurred in the context of neoliberal free market policies. And so the role of the state as a kind of urban custodian or urban regulator, if you wish, has been gradually diluted. For the construction sector, of course, these were great news because this enabled investment in construction through the provision of infrastructure, financial mechanisms, and making land available for development and leading to profit. But at the same time, it also meant that reduced or ineffectively applied regulatory controls are often poorly considered in urban development decisions. And this is what often leads to disasters. If we look at this picture here, hopefully you will notice, and I will give you a second to look at this carefully, you will hopefully notice something strange apart from a collapsed building, which is kind of strange enough on its own. So take a look. I'll pause here for a second. So what you will see here, if I zoom in, is this. And these are empty gas cans, which were filling the concrete structure. And instead, the structure should have been filled with reinforced concrete. This has happened in Taiwan, a place that is considered to be really good when it comes to seismic resistance construction. And so this is a clear example of perhaps corruption and maybe negligence that led to the collapse of this building and quite a few deaths. And this is why it is important to think of the root causes that are often created by those who make decisions. In this case, it is not the earthquake that killed those people and destroyed the building. It is this decision of putting empty gas cans instead of filling the building with concrete. And so, such acts of omission and commission may be intended or unintended, but they lead to disasters. And so it is important that the language that we use reflect that. And whilst it is very important that, of course, the public gets on board with this argument, it is also critical that we, the experts and the academics, understand that language matters. And unfortunately, a vast majority of academics and experts working in disaster field still use the term uncritically. So a couple of years ago, my comrade Jason von Medding and I did a study. We looked at almost 600 academic papers from 6 key disaster journals. And we also looked at over 400 international government organizations and non-government organizations, policies, plans, and kind of statements and different documentations. So we were searching for the natural disaster phrase in the full text. Lots of reading over the summer, it was great. And we also selected only authors who use vulnerability lens. So, kind of not just the technocratic hazard lens. And so what we found is that actually the use of misnomer increased despite all of the scholarship. What we also found is that there are 3 ways in which natural disasters phrase is used in academic publications. So in 15% of the papers that we looked at, the authors used the natural disaster misnomer because they wanted to delineate natural and man-made hazards. And so within these papers that we sampled, so within this 15% of the papers, some authors kind of demonstrate a very clear understanding that disasters are socially constructed, but then they appear to use this expression as a way of kind of indicating that disasters have a natural trigger. And so this debate has become particularly prominent in recent years because many argue that the use of expression natural disaster works, and that the language shouldn't be changed because it separates natural disasters from technological disasters, i.e. nuclear meltdown, building collapse, and like conflicts and wars. So this was kind of the first section of the papers. Then the second group of the papers, the largest group of the papers, 75%, actually used the misnomer just as a buzzword, and here where we were really kind of upset and disappointed, I guess, because here convenience clearly mattered more than clarity. So the majority of articles in this category were found to be using the expression without considering the implications of such use. And very often this expression was used alongside social vulnerability, and that produced a really kind of odd mix of language. And this is particularly problematic because the expression is being used for convenience rather than for intellectual clarity. It is often argued, and we get a lot of debates on social media, that the phrase is used because it is understood by general audience. But again, every time we engage with general audience, we see that actually people understand very well that disasters are not natural. So that argument doesn't really stand. And then there was a final category, 10% of papers. These were, of course, our favorite papers, is where the authors presented a critique. So here the authors pointed out that considering social vulnerability, economic development, culture, politics, risk perception, clarifies the connection between natural hazard and disaster outcomes. And so some authors in this category discuss interdependencies between say demographics and disaster impacts. Others argued for reconsideration of the way we understand and therefore implement disaster risk management. And so all of that led to challenging the current terminology and theory that many use in disaster studies. But overall, this 10% of papers kind of had the same message, that the root causes of social vulnerability, so power-driven processes, turn hazards into disasters, and that it is critical that the expression needs to be challenged, because otherwise it just kind of focuses on hazard rather than power-driven processes. And so overall context of all this sample is one that shows consciousness towards the fact that disasters are socially constructed. But the question is this: does expression natural disaster undermine the efforts of a vulnerability-driven narrative? Well, it does. The downside of using the expression is multifaceted. It, first of all, removes responsibility from those often at fault and lessens the likelihood of meaningful discourse around power, class, race, inequality, oppression. And these are the kind of discussions that should accompany any attempt to understand disasters. It can also serve up a narrative that prioritizes the story of a hazard and destruction over any consideration of processes of development or maldevelopment that actually lead to disaster. The expression also regularly serves the interests of the powerful as a symbolic tool, because it signifies that while we might like to prevent disaster losses in impact, we are at the mercy of nature, right? So it externalizes the threat beyond human dimension. This allows celebration of man's dominion over nature, and I choose the word man here on purpose, and maintains the power structure that might be otherwise threatened by any examination of the way that the dominant socioeconomic system, i.e. capitalism, creates risks. So the expression natural disaster is often employed by those advocating technocratic and market-based solutions, and it is unfortunately reinforced by policymakers as well as popular media. This fits really, really well with kind of free market-driven disaster industry, because seeing disaster as natural means that nature is dangerous, but we can nevertheless manage it. Or when it cannot be managed, we then blame everything on nature, right? So such position is great, and it actually reinforces the status quo, avoiding responsibility for failures in development by blaming nature. But as we were developing this work kind of into natural disasters misnomer, a few people, quite senior people, argued with us saying that, well, this is just a term of convenience, right? So why are you guys wasting your time? We, however, didn't really think so. And so we decided to prove that we are right and they're wrong, right? And encourage academic debate further. And so we started the discussion with linguists and psychologists, and these collaborations have really grown since 2018. So Jason and I teamed up with Colin Tucker-Smith and Victoria Colvin, who are based at the University of Florida, to carry out Project Implicit, that allowed us to understand better the correlation between social attitudes and the belief whether disasters are actually natural. So we have taken the harm scale and the blame scale from our first study forward to study the difference between disaster and natural disaster framing. So what we wanted to know is whether the expression itself changes the result, or kind of is it simply about deeper ideological divides. So we are finding actually a combination of both. We measured political orientation, orientation on social issues, beliefs about disasters, and preferred ways of dealing with risks with over 500 participants from 40 countries. And we found that understandings of blame, origin of risk, and preferred mitigation solutions strongly correlate with political ideology. We also found that implicit attitudes towards the underlying causes of disasters were also defined by ideological differences, and that understanding disasters as natural correlates with technocratic solutions. And this work is ongoing. So we're really excited to learn more about this, but clearly there is something in there. So there is a big correlation that we see already. But the discussion about framing of disasters spans beyond just the natural disaster misnomer. Look at the 6 terms on the slide in front of you. You may have a preferred definition for some of them, or maybe for all of them, and you may even have strong feelings about one or more. But what really is in common with these 6 terms is that there is no single meaning for any one of them. Meaning is encoded in disaster terminology, and research and practice can both become problematic when disaster terms are conceptualized too narrowly. The different encoded meanings emerge from ideological perspectives very often, and they also demonstrate political agendas, because disasters are very much political, and therefore the way we talk about them is also political. And an excellent example of this is a concept of resilience. And so now I'm going to risk the technology and see what happens. So if you could all either scan the QR code or just go to the vvox.app, the app would ask you to input this code, and hopefully we will be able to do some voting. So once you're in the system, I would like you to just type in one word that comes to mind when you hear a word resilience. Now, anything that comes to mind, please type in, and hopefully we will be able to see this. I'm sure. So if you have more than one word, you can just underscore if it's a phrase, right? So it would come up as one word. Let's try strength. Yeah, great. So anything goes. You know, whatever comes to mind when you hear resilience, just type it in. Solid, yeah. Grit, bounce, not give up, yeah, very good. Let's see a few more. Oh, it moved. Flexible, yeah. Maybe a couple of more. Rebounding. Learned, yeah, right. So we can kind of see here, and I can see that 8 people logged in, that this courage, it's all about strength and faith, right? And like, yeah, great, really great word. So something positive, right? And kind of strong. And this really reflects the argument that we build. Oh, I'm sorry. Around disasters. Sorry, my slides have all gone a little bit funny. And you know, these words that you've just typed in show this quite well. So you picked up on some of the ideas that are really prominent in disaster discourse. But what we also know is that there is no single definition for the word resilience in disaster studies. You know, the term, it kind of very often is mentioned in relation to desired states, but very often we kind of also talk about surviving high impact but relatively low frequency events, right? And what we really want when we talk about resilience is quickly getting basic urban function back, right? But we don't really talk about addressing the root cause of a disaster. So resilience for a long time has been interpreted as kind of going back to normal, or, you know, bouncing back. But of course, the implication of using this type of concept is that resilience is then reduced to the emergency situation, right? And so we just go back to the original state. And many have found this problematic because perhaps normal, or this return to normal, isn't great, because if something happened, right, if the normal was affected, it means that the original state wasn't great, right? It wasn't resilient to begin with. And so then this new narrative appeared about bouncing forward. This narrative was built on the premise that disaster should be used as an opportunity to kind of to regroup and become better than the original state. But then, of course, many people interpreted this bouncing forward very differently, and we've seen this in many disasters. You know, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans is actually a really, really good example where some have kind of interpreted the disaster as an opportunity to use it as a unique moment to push out unwanted communities and jump on the bandwagon of kind of neoliberal urban planning, seeking economic gain over social equality. And so bouncing forward very often ended up being a recreation of risks that have already been there, because we only focused on the immediate. And then the new motto came into our lives, and that is building back better. And building back better is something that I really want to talk about now. Again, my comrade Wes Cheek and I recently wrote in Current Affairs about this. So slogan building back better accompanies resilience a lot. And, you know, for us people in disaster kind of studies and international development, it wasn't a new slogan. It was really popularized in the international development by Bill Clinton, who coined it after the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2005. So that was his kind of motto for the reconstruction. But since then, Building Back Better has become a kind of slogan for best practices for international framework for post-disaster recovery. But there is certainly more to it now. In 2020, all of the disaster communities were kind of taken aback because Building Back Better became a cliche on many policymakers' lips. On 30th of June 2020, the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson promised to undertake, and I quote, "the most radical reforms to our planning system since the Second World War, as this will help to build back better, build back greener, build back faster, in order to boost spending on infrastructure as a way for leveling up the country and avoid economic recession." It was also used by Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And of course, it became the centerpiece for now President Biden's campaign. The emphasis of Building Back Better is on continuity, i.e. to keep on going no matter what. So the goal is not to alleviate the original conditions that created the crisis, but rather to quickly move past the crisis without altering the underlying political, societal, or economic structures. And so the emphasis, this emphasis is the core of neoliberalism, right? Not as a mode of economic management, but as a mode of political rationality and government reasoning that constructs and regulates the realm in which disaster unfolds. So contradiction here is that as a disaster exposes and is grounded in this kind of underlying inequalities, neoliberalism actually builds on these inequalities, to keep itself going. And in disasters, people can lose livelihood, shelter, family, sense of dignity. So everything that makes their daily life possible. But what we need to keep in mind is that disasters don't affect everybody equally, right? And for those of us who have no voice in decision making or no claim to kind of official place to live, disasters are a daily, right? For them, it's not a shock event. It's just something that exacerbates and exposes the harm that they're exposed to. And so characterized as a way for people and societies to become more resilient, Building Back Better epistemizes this problematic ideology of resilience, because disasters are portrayed as unexpected external shocks, and they're naturalized through this narrative of resilience, and they are framed as inevitable. But actually, what we need to talk about is their root causes. So resilience kind of became this panacea for all the contemporary issues, but that is not the case. As Sarah Brack notes, resilience makes people, or kind of shows that people can absorb the impact of austerity measures and continue to be productive. So what it means is that resilience message essentially tells us that, being resilient is good and everybody should be good, right? Because we're good citizens. But if you're not resilient, it means that you can't cope. So we can kind of keep knocking and throw things at you, and you need to cope as an individual. And so what it also emphasizes here is that the choice of words really matters, right? And that the way we frame them also really matters. And this is problematic not just for English language. There is now another problem in which we treat the kind of the meanings that we put in these words as apolitical, but these meanings are Anglophone, right? And so the issue of translation comes to play. So as I said already, we teamed up with linguists because we're really interested in how different terms that we use in disasters actually translate, or do they translate? And so we looked at 6 terms that we use in disaster studies so much. So resilience, vulnerability, capacity, hazard, risk, and disaster. And we translated this with the help of our friends and colleagues all around the world into 53 languages. And then we looked at this translation with the support from a linguist colleague, Neil Sadler, who is based in Belfast. And so what we found wasn't really surprising. We found that these terms do not translate very well. And what they reinforce is actually the Anglophone hegemony and the kind of the power that comes with it. Some of us may see translation as kind of mechanical operation, right? But it is not. There are lots of approaches to how translation happens, and the approaches that we take therefore put different meanings to it. So for example, for those of us reading a translation might use resilience as strength, right? As some of you have put in the voting tool. But for example, in Afrikaans, resilience literally means bouncy, bouncy, so like spring-like. What does it mean? You know, what if we take this into account and kind of start thinking about disasters from the perspective of the language in which we want to use this word? Would our research have more impact if we actually learn from different individuals and communities in their own voice and in their own terms? You know, what would it do for our framing of disasters? And these questions that we and you need to be asking as we're moving into the future, because there is hope and you are that hope. In order to contribute to the shift in thinking and discourse, the experts, the academics in the field, including individuals and organizations, academic and non-academic, need to be more deliberate and measured in the words that we use. What is often simply a lack of kind of careful and consistent language actually fuels a cycle of misinformation. We must push back against short-term profit-oriented or headline-grabbing thinking. So language, and most importantly, how we frame what we say, matters. Many of us are getting together to write, talk, challenge, explain, educate, and learn, but most importantly, to encourage dialogue that would lead to reframing of disasters, to shift it from hazard to root causes. No Natural Disasters campaign on social media has gained amazing prominence, and thanks to Kevin Blanchard, who's really leading the social media effort. UN has now changed the way they talk about disasters, which is great. We publish a lot in non-academic outlets. We talk to main media outlets such as CNN, for instance, and of course, Jason and I have our podcast, which we're trying to engage as many voices as we possibly can. So when we speak about disasters, we need to talk about the systemic root causes of disasters that are grounded in oppression and marginalization. What we say and do when it comes to disaster risk reduction should be about ethics, equity, power, and responsibility, and not about hazards. And I want to finish with a quote by one of my favorite thinkers, Paulo Freire. As long as I fight, I am moved by hope. And if I fight with hope, then I can wait. Thanks so much.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I know we have about 10 minutes left or so, and some audience members had used the Q&A function to ask some questions that I will go ahead and read off. One being, is the prospective cities in 2100 chosen based on elevation and prospective agricultural access given anticipated water level and climate shifts?
Could you repeat that? Sorry, I missed the first part.
No worries. It reads, is the prospective cities in 2100 chosen based on elevation and prospective agricultural access given anticipated water level and climate shifts?
I got it now. Thank you so much. So yes and no. Basically, these are the cities. Of course, these are projections, right? Things may change completely. And COVID kind of has changed significantly the way cities operate now. But so these projections are based on the current economic growth of the cities, because economic growth is how we measure everything, unfortunately, right? Climate shifts and water shortages, for example, are taken into account, but they're taken into account not as a threat that would stop the growth of the city, but the threat that the city would experience, right? And so that's the narrative of kind of how we should deal with that. And the narrative usually ends up being a technocratic solution.
Great, thank you. I believe the other two we have are general comments that I'll just go ahead and read off, and then feel free to add your dialogue as well. One reads, to me, the only means that would work to help fix these issues is to institute a global requirement in governmental, societal, and civil institutions, structures, and rights, lead by waves of the upcoming generations who are all encouraged and given all the abilities to learn and understand the nature of the interdependence of people and our entire planet. This would require an entire worldwide shift in economic and power distribution across multiple nations, such that local populations are distributed resources, but then encouraged to maintain self-sufficiency and export resources available to be given to other needing areas that may be deficient in a separate modality.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this you know, challenging and actually addressing these problems would take a massive shift. It requires it requires kind of removal of the capitalist status quo, right? Because we cannot keep building and growing economically if we really want to if we really want to live better. And to me, there is actually a lot of hope, because we've seen, particularly in the last year and a half, again, so much solidarity and so much love and care. And I think this is what is really important, right? And we're kind of going back to this idea of care, and realizing that we cannot exist without one another, right? So this idea of interdependence and fragility and vulnerability that we need to acknowledge, right? And this is what allows us to rely on one another, is really, really important. So you people are the future. The hope is on you. We're getting old.
I also have a quick comment based on your conversation about the use of language and the importance of avoiding perhaps using the term natural disaster. Sort of makes me think of the idea of human development, and the idea in the age of the Anthropocene that the many crises that we face today are man-made or human-made, and that development is really driven by human beings now. So I was just wondering if you, in your research, had made any connections to ideas of human development in general.
It's kind of, yes, in that it is all rooted in human development, right? And this is why we're saying that really, if we have to trace the root causes of disasters, we kind of need to go into like centuries, right? Say the oppression that we now see with Black population, right, and people of color, it all goes back to slavery, right, and slave trades. And this is why we still see that marginalization now, and then it's just being exposed more in disasters. And so human development is at the core of everything that we talk about, and it is the kind of the way that we see development, i.e. in growth, right, and the way we measure development in progress, that is problematic. And of course, it is driven by humans and for humans. And so we just something that we need to challenge.
Definitely. One other question we just got, for the point of not using natural disaster, is the point to accept that any disaster, no matter how you attribute it, has points of improvement that we can implement and discuss socially to help prevent future damages from, for example, weather phenomena? Or is it that means of these weather phenomena are chiefly man-made and their effects are amplified by our Saudi care and concern for good development practices and disaster relief and reconstruction?
So it's both. Because so not all hazards are climate induced, right? If we think of, say, earthquakes or volcanic eruptions, right, they're not climate induced. So the first point is really important, in that all disasters are attributed to social development, right? And so we don't have to end up with a disaster if the society is more equitable, right, and has kind of better distribution of resources, and because the vulnerability would be reduced. So we would say all be able to access healthcare, right, and we would all be able to access early warning systems, right, and we would have resources to actually evacuate should we wish to. Because very often we know about hazards, right? Earthquake is pretty much kind of the last hazard that we cannot really predict, right? So it happens. But even then, we can build houses that can withstand the earthquakes, but not everybody can afford living in these houses. And this is where the problems start. And then, of course, with climate-induced hazards, the anthropogenic causes are really, really important. And that's what Regina was talking about this morning, right? In that we need to mitigate and not just adapt. The adaptation is important because we're now so far kind of into this climate breakdown, but we need to keep mitigating, because it is our fault as human beings who kind of, and the industrial revolution has led to it. And then, of course, now we are also expecting the global south to catch up with our great developed levels, right? Which is again measured in economic growth, and that just reinforces the cycle of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions and inequalities that it kind of comes in parallel.
I wonder if you could speak to sort of the role of faith-based organizations in sort of reinforcing disaster capitalism. If that's something that you've come across in terms of how, you know, charity and whatnot becomes sort of a major reinforcement of disaster capitalism.
How long do you have, Adam? So
3 minutes.
yeah, 3 minutes. I know. Well, yes. So you know, aid is a kind of difficult thing to talk about, right, in 3 minutes. But very often, so there are two things. First, we very often see aid as our own. Oh, look, I've given $50, right, and I feel bad about myself. So it's about individualistic kind of feeling good attitude. But also the way that aid operates is very often through government organizations who do not distribute resources equally. There are some excellent root kind of grassroots organizations that do fantastic job, but it's very often to reach them, very difficult to reach them quite often. And so I think when we talk about aid, we need to sort of differentiate between charity and white savior, right? And then the actual support in the communities. So we don't just put the band-aid, but actually help and resist the structural inequality. So this is where the support needs to go to.
Great, thank you.
If we don't have any remaining questions, thank you so much for your time and for such an engaging presentation. And thank you to those who stayed on.